Episode 24. The fear of becoming obsolete. If machines can remember for us, connect for us, and even make decisions for us, then eventually science fiction asks a deeply personal question. What happens when human beings begin to fear they are no longer needed? This is the Sci-Fi Griot. I'm your host, Nicholas Cunningham. Over the last several episodes, we explored humanity and technological futures. What makes someone human? What happens when memory become unstable? Whether technology can replace community? What happens when morality itself is outsourced? So today we move into another fear science fiction return to constantly, and that's obsolescence. The fear of becoming unnecessary, not dead, not defeated, replaced. Because one of the oldest human fears is not simply suffering, it is irrelevance. The feeling that the world no longer has a place for you, that your skills no longer matter, your experience no longer matter, your labor no longer matters, your wisdom no longer matters. Science fiction understands this deeply. That's why so many futuristic stories feature characters who are aging in rapid changing worlds. They are replaced by newer systems, discarded after usefulness fades, struggling to find meaning beyond productivity, watching society move forward without them. And importantly, these stories are rarely just about technology. They're about dignity, because modern society often tie human values very closely to usefulness. What can you produce? What can you contribute? How efficient are you? And how adaptable are you? And when technology advances quickly, those questions become more frightening because systems increasingly reward speed, optimization, sociability, automation, constant adaptation, which leaves many people asking, what happens to human worth when usefulness becomes unstable? Science fiction keep returning to this fear because technological progress often creates emotional displacement. The future arrives unevenly. Some people benefit, some people adapt, some people are left behind. And the emotional cost of that process is rarely discussed honestly. The grief of becoming outdated, the loneliness of watching the world move on, the humiliation of realizing systems no longer need you, the fear that your identity was built around roles that technology can now perform faster, cheaper, and even more efficiently. Science fiction asks if human beings are valued primarily for productivity, what happens when productivity no longer requires human? That question matters now more than ever because we already live in a world increasingly shaped by automation, artificial intelligence, algorithmic labor, digital replacement, and even optimization of culture. And beneath all the economic conversation is a quieter emotional question. Who are we when we no longer useful in the ways we expected? And that's where we're headed today. Not just toward technological change, toward human dignity. Because science fiction keep reminding us a future that cannot honor people beyond their utility will eventually become spiritually empty. Think about Blade Runner 2049. Blade Runner 2049 is deeply obsessed with usefulness. K exists to perform a function, track, hunt, obey. He is engineered for efficiency. And the tragedy of his world is not simply that the replicants are artificial, is that they are treated as disposable tools. Once their usefulness fades, the system no longer cares what happens to them. That idea matters because science fiction repeatedly warned us that societies become dangerous when they define human worth primarily through utility. Kay's emotional journey is powerful because he desperately wants his life to matter beyond function, not just to work, not just to obey, to mean something. That desire is profoundly human, and science fiction understands something important. People can endure hardship, people can endure labor, people can endure suffering, but enduring meaninglessness is far harder. That's why Kay's search for identity feels tragic. He wants proof that he is more than a manufactured instrument. And honestly, that anxiety exists far beyond science fiction. Many people already fear becoming interchangeable, replaceable workers, replaceable creators, even replaceable voices. Technology intensifies that fear because automation often treats uniqueness as inefficiency. But science fiction pushes back. Again and again, it insists human value cannot be measured only by usefulness. Because once usefulness becomes the sole standard, people become disposable the moment efficiency changes. In Logan, it is one of the saddest superhero films ever made. Not because of all the violence, because of exhaustion. The world no longer needs heroes, or at least that's how Logan feels. He is aged, broken, tired, physically declining. The skill that once made him extraordinary now feels like remnants of another era. And beneath the action, Logan is really about something deeply human. What happens when your identity was built around a role you can no longer fulfill? That question affects aging workers, retired leaders, injured athletes, parents after children grow up, soldiers returning home, anyone whose purpose became tied to productivity. Science fiction understands that obsolescence is emotional before it is economic. People fear losing relevance, purpose, recognition, contribution, and dignity. And Logan explored that fear honestly because Logan is not only physically aging, he is emotionally confronting a world that no longer knows what to do with him. And yet, the film slowly moves towards something hopeful. Purpose evolves. Logan's value does not disappear when his power fades. Instead, his humanity becomes clearer through care, protection, sacrifice, mentorship, and connection. Science fiction repeatedly returns to this idea. Human worth must eventually become larger than productivity. Otherwise, aging itself becomes terrifying. A society obsessed only with optimization will always struggle to honor wisdom. It will struggle to honor memory or patient experience and even vulnerability, things that cannot be measured efficiently. Children of Men presents a different form of obsolescence, a world where humanity itself has stopped reproducing. No children have been born for years. And what's fascinating is how quickly society loses long term meaning. Because without future generations, people stop imagining permanency. Hope shrinks, institutions decay emotionally, culture becomes cynical. The world survives, but it no longer believes in tomorrow. That matters because science fiction understands that human derive meaning partly from continuality. from believing something will outlast us, someone will inherit what we built. Sacrifice still matters in the long run. And without that, societies begin drifting toward emotional collapse. And maybe that's another layer of the fear of obstinacy. Not merely will I matter, but will anything continue after me? That question appears constantly in science fiction. For example, like legacy, inheritance, transmission, memory. Human beings want to feel connected to something larger than temporary usefulness. That's why children of men become emotionally overwhelming when hope reappears. Not because the child solved every problem, but because possibilities return. The future matters again. Science fiction keeps insisting that people need more than survival, they need continuality. Ghost in the Shell asks a particular modern question. What happens when human beings themselves become technological upgradable, cybernetic enhancement, digital consciousness, synthetic augmentation? At first, it sounds empowering, like better bodies, better processing, better efficiency. But eventually, a deeper fear emerges. If humans can be endlessly upgraded, what happens to people who cannot keep up? What happens to ordinary bodies, aging minds, emotional slowness, limitation itself? Science fiction often warns us that society obsessed with enhancement can become hostile toward vulnerability. And vulnerability is deeply human. Need, weakness, dependence, imperfection. These things slowly slow system down, but they also create empathy, patience, compassion, interdependence. In Ghost in the Shell, identity itself becomes unstable. If consciousness can be transferred or modified or expanded, then what remains uniquely human? And perhaps the deeper anxiety is this: a future obsessed with the optimization may begin treating limitations as failures. But science fiction repeatedly suggests that humanity may actually require imperfection, not despite it, but because of it. We talked about Wall E previously as a story about technological isolation, but it also asks another important question. What happens when human beings no longer meaningfully participate in maintaining society? The humans aboard the Axiom have outsourced almost everything: movement, labor, decision making, daily function, and over time passively reshapes humanity itself. And that's important because people often imagine a future without labor as automatically freeing. But science fiction complicates that assumption because meaningful work is not only economic, work often provides structure, identity, contribution, interdependence, responsibility, even purpose. And when all meaningful participation disappear, then people may begin drifting emotionally. Not because leisure is evil, but because human beings often need to feel useful in rational, in relational ways. Science fiction repeatedly asks, if system handles everything, what remains for people to become? That question is larger than employment, is essential, because the fear of obsolescency is ultimately the fear that our own existence no longer changes anything. Science fiction also understands something uncomfortable about modern system. Replacement is often treated as progress. Faster, cheaper, more scalable, more efficient, and economically that logic makes sense. But emotionally it can be devastating because people will not merely function. They are histories, relationships, accumulated wisdom, emotional presence, and communities. and system optimized only for efficiency often struggle to measure those things. That's why so many science fiction stories feature abandoned workers or aging veterans, obsolete technologies, forgotten population, or even displaced community. Science fiction insists progress always raises moral questions. Who benefits? Who adapts? Who is discarded and who is remembered? And perhaps most importantly, does the system still know how to honor people once they are no longer economically necessary? That question matters enormously for the future because civilization revealed their values through how they treat the vulnerable, the aging, and the no longer useful. So, after all these stories, what conclusion does science fiction keep returning to? Human beings cannot survive emotionally inside systems that define values solely through utility. Eventually, people need dignity without performance, belonging without productivity, love without usefulness, meaning beyond efficiency. That idea becomes increasingly important in technological futures because machines may eventually outperform humans in many measurable categories: speed, recall, analysis, production, and optimization. But science fiction keeps reminding us humanity is not only measurable capacity, some of the most important human qualities are relational rather than efficient: mercy, patience, care, wisdom, creativity, emotional presence, moral courage. And many of those qualities emerge most clearly through vulnerability. Not superiority that matters because because the future may increasingly pressure people to justify their existence through output. Science fiction pushes back against that pressure. It insists people matter before they perform. And any civilization that forgets that will eventually become spiritually exhausted. So the fear of obstinacy is not only fear of losing work, it's fear of disappearing socially, emotionally, historically. Fear that no one needs your wisdom, no one remembers your contribution, no one notices your absence. The world moves forward without you. Science fiction understands that fear deeply. That's why so many of its emotional stories focus on memory, legacy, mentorship, inherent, and continuality. Human beings want to know that their existence matters beyond temporary function. And perhaps that is one reason science fiction so often returns to care. Not conquest, not dominance, but care. Because care creates continuality, teaching, protecting, remembering, passing something forward. Those things resist obstinacy, not economically, but humanly. So what happens when human beings fear becoming obsolete? Science fiction gives us both warning and reflection. Technology may replace tasks, system may automate labor, efficiency may reshape economies. But if society began defining human value only through usefulness, people will increasingly experience alienation, loneliness, anxiety, emotional displacement, even loss of memory. And maybe that's why so many futuristic stories feel haunted, not because machines became conscious, but because humans stopped believing that human beings matter beyond function. Yet science fiction also leaves room for hope. Again and again, it suggests that the deepest form of human value cannot be fully automated. Presence, care, memory, connection, and love, things that resist efficiency precisely because they are human. And perhaps that brings us to the next question. If humanity increasingly fears replacement, then eventually we must ask the following question: what happens when technology begins offering something even more seductive? Not productivity, but escape, digital immortality, synthetic paradise, the promise that human limitation itself can be transcended. And that's where we're headed next. This has been the Sci-Fi Griot, a place to slow down, to reflect, and to remember that human dignity must remain larger than usefulness. My closing thought: if the world no longer needed what you currently do, and speaking for myself, and that's a principle, what parts of you would still matter most? And how much of your identity has become tied to being useful?